Sarah's blood froze as 100 Comanche warriors surrounded her isolated farm at dawn, their weapons raised, their faces painted for war. The wounded boy she'd sheltered through the night now stood between her children and certain death, speaking rapidly to the chief in a language she couldn't understand. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The skies had been threatening all day, dark clouds gathering over the vast Nebraska prairie like harbingers of doom. Sarah Holloway stood on the weather-beaten porch of her farmhouse, one hand shielding her eyes as she scanned the horizon. The wind whipped her faded cotton dress against her legs and tugged strands of chestnut hair from her simple bun. There was a heaviness in the air that spoke of more than just the coming storm. "Ma, the chickens are all in," called 10-year-old Emma from the small coop beside the barn. Her daughter's voice carried on the wind, bright and clear despite the gathering gloom. "Good girl," Sarah called back. "Now come inside before this rain starts in earnest." 2 years, 2 long years since Thomas had drawn his last ragged breath, his body consumed by the fever that had swept through the settlement that terrible winter. Sometimes it felt like yesterday. Other times, it seemed a lifetime ago. Sarah had learned to shoulder burdens she'd never imagined bearing, fixing the leaking roof, negotiating prices for their wheat harvest, fending off the occasional unwanted suitor who thought a widow with 2 children and 80 acres would be grateful for any offer of marriage. Emma darted across the yard, her younger brother Daniel trailing behind, clutching a wooden toy soldier Thomas had carved during those long winter evenings when they'd all huddled around the fire. Sarah felt the familiar ache in her chest at the sight of that small token of a lost life. "Storm's gonna be a big one," said Daniel matter-of-factly, his 7-year-old voice trying to mimic the gravity he'd heard in his father's. The birds were flying low all day. Sarah smiled and ruffled his sandy hair. "You're becoming quite the weather prophet, Danny. Your pa would be proud." Thunder rumbled in the distance as they entered the cabin. The interior was simple but clean, a testament to Sarah's determination that hardship would not mean squalor. The main room served as kitchen and living area, both with a sturdy table Thomas had built from oaken, 4 mismatched chairs, and a stone fireplace where a small fire crackled, pushing back against the unnatural chill of the stormy evening. "I'll finish the stew," Sarah said, moving toward the iron pot hanging over the flames. Emma set the table. "Daniel, make sure the shutters are secured tight." The children moved, with the efficiency born of routine. Out here, 20 miles from the nearest town, self-reliance wasn't a virtue. It was survival. Sarah stirred the rabbit stew, adding a pinch of precious salt. The garden had yielded well this year. Potatoes, carrots, and beans supplemented what game she could trap or shoot with Thomas's old rifle. She'd learned to hunt out of necessity, though the weight of the gun still felt unnatural in her hands. The first fat raindrops began to hit the roof as they sat down to eat. By the time they'd finished their simple meal, the storm had arrived in full fury, rain lashing against the windows while thunder crashed overhead. The children sat near the fire, Emma reading aloud from one of the 3 books they owned, while Daniel whittled at a piece of wood with determined concentration. Sarah was washing the dishes when she heard it, a sound distinct from the storm's rage. A soft thud against the door, followed by what might have been a moan. She froze, dish rag dripping onto the floor. Raiders sometimes took advantage of bad weather, knowing homesteaders would be distracted by the elements. She cast a quick glance at the rifle mounted above the fireplace. The sound came again, weaker this time. "Stay here," she told the children, her voice brooking no argument. Emma pulled Daniel closer to her side, both pairs of eyes wide with sudden fear. Sarah took down the rifle, checked that it was loaded, and approached the door. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she called out, "Who's there?" No response came except the howling of the wind. Taking a deep breath, she unlatched the door and pulled it open just enough to peer out into the rain-soaked darkness. Lightning flashed, illuminating a small, crumpled form on her porch, a child face down and unmoving. Sarah flung the door wide. "Emma, bring the lamp!" She knelt beside the figure, a boy, she realized, no more than 12 years old. His black hair was plastered to his head, and his clothes were a sodden mixture of animal skins and rough cloth. When Sarah gently turned him over, she gasped. His features were distinctly Native American, his skin copper beneath the pallor of exhaustion and pain. A nasty gash ran the length of his right forearm, still seeping blood. "Ma, he's Indian," Emma whispered, holding the lamp with trembling hands. Sarah hesitated only a moment. The tensions between settlers and the native tribes, particularly the Comanche, had escalated over the past months. Just 3 weeks ago, the Wilsons' farm 10 miles east had been raided, their barn burned and livestock taken. Stories of atrocities on both sides traveled fast across the prairie. But this was a child, wounded and helpless in the storm. "Help me get him inside," Sarah said firmly, sliding her arms beneath the boy's shoulders. "But Ma," Emma began. "He's a child, Emma. No different from you or your brother." Sarah's voice was gentle but resolute. "Now help me before this rain soaks us all to the bone." Together, they carried the unconscious boy into the cabin and laid him on the bearskin rug before the fire. Daniel stood back, clutching his toy soldier like a talisman, eyes round with a mixture of fear and fascination. Up close, Sarah could see distinctive markings on the boy's clothing. Beadwork patterns she recognized from her encounters with the Comanche, who occasionally traded at the settlement. A small medicine pouch hung from a cord around his neck, and a single eagle feather, now bedraggled from the rain, was woven into one of his braids. "Emma, fetch my sewing kit and the whiskey from the high shelf. Daniel, bring more wood for the fire. This child is chilled to the bone." As the children scurried to obey, Sarah gently brushed the wet hair from the boy's forehead. His skin burned with fever, a stark contrast to his cold and wet clothes. Without hesitation, she began removing his sodden garments, leaving only his breechcloth for modesty. She covered him with one of their precious woolen blankets, then turned her attention to the wound on his arm. The gash was deep, the edges jagged, made by a blade, not an animal or accident. The boy had been in a fight, perhaps fled from danger. Sarah cleaned the wound with whiskey, wincing in sympathy when the boy moaned in unconscious pain. With deft fingers that had mended countless garments and occasionally her children's injured bodies, she stitched the wound closed, then bound it with strips of clean cloth. "Will he die, Ma?" Daniel whispered, having crept closer to watch her work. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Sarah replied, determination hardening her voice. As if in response to her words, the boy's eyelids fluttered open. Dark, confused eyes stared up at her, then widened in alarm. He tried to scramble away, but weakness and pain prevented his escape. Words spilled from his lips in a language Sarah couldn't understand. "It's all right," she said softly, raising her empty hands to show she meant no harm. "You're safe here. I'm trying to help you." The boy stared at her, breathing fast, eyes darting to the children who stood watching from a cautious distance. Outside, thunder crashed, making them all jump. Rain continued to lash against the windows, emphasizing the shelter of the warm cabin. Slowly, Sarah reached for a cup of water. She took a small sip herself, then offered it to the boy. "Water," she said clearly, then added, "Drink." After a moment's hesitation, he took the cup with his uninjured hand and drank greedily. When he finished, he touched his bandaged arm, then looked at Sarah with a mixture of suspicion and grudging gratitude. "What's your name?" she asked, tapping her chest. "I'm Sarah." The boy seemed to understand the gesture. He tapped his own chest and said, "Tabe, Tabe," Sarah repeated, smiling gently. "You're welcome here, Tabe, until the storm passes. Until you're well." Whether he understood her words or merely her tone, some of the tension left his body. He leaned back against the chair leg, exhaustion evident in every line of his young face. That night, as the storm raged outside, Sarah sat vigil by the fire, watching the slow rise and fall of Tabe's chest. The children slept in the loft above, though she doubted Emma's sleep was sound. Her daughter had inherited Thomas's cautious nature, his tendency to see the world in terms of threats to be assessed. Sarah understood the risk she was taking. If Tab's people came looking for him, if they thought she had harmed him, or if he himself proved dangerous once recovered. But as she watched the boy's face, peaceful now in sleep, she couldn't regret her decision. Some choices transcended fear, transcended the bitter divisions that had turned neighbor against neighbor, settler against native. Some choices were simply human. Dawn broke with tentative fingers of light stretching across the sodden prairie. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed, pools of water where there had been only dust the day before, tree branches scattered like broken promises across the yard. Sarah stood at the window, a cup of steaming chicory coffee warming her hands, watching as the world emerged from darkness. Behind her, Tabe slept on the bearskin rug, his breathing deeper and more regular than it had been during the night. Several times she had placed a cool cloth on his forehead as fever threatened to take hold. Now, in the gentle morning light, his color looked better, the angry red around his wound less pronounced. A floorboard creaked overhead, and Sarah glanced up to see Emma descending the ladder from the loft, her nightgown rumpled, hair in disarray. The girl's eyes immediately went to the sleeping figure by the hearth. "He's still here," she whispered, as if speaking normally might summon danger. Sarah nodded. "His fever broke about an hour ago. I think he'll mend well enough." Emma fidgeted with the end of her braid. "What if his people come looking for him? Pa used to say the Comanche don't forgive those who harm their children." "We haven't harmed him," Sarah replied, though a flicker of unease passed through her at the thought. "In fact, quite the opposite." But will they see it that way? The question hung in the air between them, impossible to answer with certainty. Sarah had heard the stories, settlers found with arrows in their backs, homesteads burned to the ground, women and children taken captive. She'd also heard whispers of native villages destroyed by militia, of broken treaties and stolen lands. The truth, as Thomas had often said, was rarely as simple as people wanted it to be. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Sarah said finally. "For now, we have chores waiting." The storm won't have done the garden any favors. As if on cue, there was a small moan from the fireside. Tab's eyes fluttered open, immediately alert despite his weakened state. He pushed himself up on his good arm, glancing warily around the cabin until his gaze settled on Sarah. "Good morning," she said, keeping her voice gentle. She touched her bandaged arm, then pointed to his. "How does it feel?" Tabe looked down at his wrapped wound, touched it gingerly, then met her eyes again. He tapped his chest. "Tabe," he said, then pointed to her with a questioning look. "Sarah," she replied, tapping her own chest. Then she gestured to Emma, who stood frozen by the ladder. "Emma?" At that moment, Daniel clambered down from the loft, rubbing sleep from his eyes. When he spotted Tabe awake, he stopped abruptly, curiosity overtaking caution. "Is he a real Indian warrior?" he asked, loud enough to make Emma wince. Before Sarah could answer, Tabe's face broke into an unexpected smile. He pointed at Daniel and raised his eyebrows at Sarah. "Daniel," she said, "my son." Taabe nodded, then reached slowly into the small medicine pouch that still hung around his neck. He withdrew something and extended his hand toward Daniel. The boy looked to his mother, who nodded permission. Cautiously, he approached and accepted the gift, a small carving of a horse, beautifully rendered in pale wood. Daniel's face lit up. "Thank you," he said, examining the carving with reverence. Taabe pointed to himself, then made a carving motion with his hands. "You made this?" Sarah asked, miming the same action. Taabe nodded, pride evident in his posture despite his injuries. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, and though he couldn't understand her words, her admiring tone needed no translation. Over the next few hours, as Sarah and the children moved through their morning chores, a tentative communication began to develop. Taabe, though clearly still weak, insisted on sitting up, watching their activities with intelligent eyes. When Emma brought a bowl of porridge sweetened with precious molasses, he accepted it with dignity, waiting until she had stepped back before eating. Outside, Sarah assessed the storm damage. 2 fence posts had been knocked down, and the vegetable garden was partially flooded. She sighed, calculating how much time it would take to repair the damage alone. Thomas would have had it fixed in a day, but she had learned to accept that some tasks simply took her longer. When she returned to the cabin with an armload of salvaged vegetables, she found an unexpected scene. Taabe had moved to the table where Daniel sat with his slate, practicing his letters. The Comanche boy was watching intently, and when Daniel wrote his name in careful, childish script, Taabe pointed to it, then to himself. Daniel nodded enthusiastically. "You want to write your name too?" He offered the slate and chalk. Taabe took them carefully. After studying Daniel's writing for a moment, he began to draw on the slate, not letters, but a pictograph of an antelope. "Taabe," he said, pointing to the drawing, then to himself. "Your name means antelope?" Daniel asked, fascinated. Taabe nodded, seeming to understand the question. Sarah watched from the doorway, struck by the simple interaction between 2 children from worlds that had been at war for generations. There was a lesson here, she thought, if only grown men with their pride and politics could see it. The peaceful moment was shattered by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Sarah's heart leaped to her throat as she hurried to the window. A rider was approaching from the east, not a Comanche warrior, but Elijah Garrett, one of their nearest neighbors at 3 miles distant. "Emma, take Taabe to the back room," Sarah said quickly. "Daniel, not a word about our guest." Emma hesitated only briefly before helping Taabe to his feet. The boy seemed to understand the sudden tension and didn't resist as Emma led him through the curtained doorway to the small room where Sarah slept. Sarah smoothed her apron and hair, then stepped onto the porch as Elijah reined in his horse. "Morning, Mrs. Holloway," he called, touching the brim of his hat. Elijah was a widower himself, about 50, with graying hair and a perpetually sunburned face. He'd helped her with the heavier farm work on occasion, never asking for payment beyond a home-cooked meal. "And saw your chimney smoke and thought I'd check how you weathered the storm." "We're fine, thank you," Sarah replied, keeping her voice casual despite her racing pulse. "Lost a few fence posts, but nothing serious." Elijah nodded, dismounting with a grunt. "Lucky then. The Parker's Creek flooded, took out half their corn." He glanced around the yard, eyes narrowing slightly. "Saw some unusual tracks heading this way when I was riding up." "Moccasin prints. Looked like you haven't had any visitors, have you?" Sarah's mouth went dry. She'd been so focused on caring for Taabe that she hadn't considered he might have left a trail. "No," she said, the lie bitter on her tongue. "No visitors, Elijah studied her face for a moment too long. Well, that's good. Word is there's been Comanche movement to the south. Johnson's boy was out hunting yesterday and swears he saw smoke signals. I haven't seen anything, Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Elijah spat tobacco juice into the dirt. They're saying a militia might be formed after what happened to the Wilsons. And what exactly happened to the Wilsons? Sarah asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Well, because I've heard 3 different versions. Don't much matter which version, Elijah replied. Dead is dead, and taking no chances is how folks like us stay alive out here. He glanced toward the cabin, and Sarah resisted the urge to step more firmly in his path. You got that rifle of Thomas's loaded and ready? I can take care of my family, she said firmly. Something in her tone must have convinced him, because he nodded and remounted his horse. Well, I'd best continue my rounds. The Murphys are next. If you need anything, I know where to find you, Sarah finished. Thank you for checking on us, Elijah. She watched him ride away, relief and guilt warring in her chest. When she returned inside, Emma had already brought Taba back to the main room. The boy looked at her with questioning eyes, too perceptive not to have sensed the tension. It's all right, she told him, not knowing if he understood. Just a neighbor. But later, when the children were occupied with chores, Tabe approached her as she kneaded dough for the day's bread. He pointed to the window, then made a gesture with his hand, like a bird flying away. You want to leave? Sarah asked, mimicking the gesture. Taabe nodded solemnly, then pointed in the direction Elijah had come from, drawing his finger across his throat in a universal gesture of threat. Sarah felt a chill run through her. You understand more than I thought, she murmured. Louder, she said. You're not well enough yet. Your arm needs time to heal. To demonstrate, she touched her own arm, then shook her head. Tabe frowned, but seemed to accept her logic. He returned to the fire, where he had been showing Daniel how to shape wood with the small knife Sarah had reluctantly allowed him to use. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah sat at the table mending one of Daniel's shirts by lamplight. Tabe watched her from his place by the fire, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. Where is your family? She asked softly, not expecting an answer. She touched her chest, then gestured around, raising her eyebrows in question. Taabe hesitated, then pointed to the south. He held up all his fingers twice. 20. Then he touched his chest and made a rocking motion with his arms. You have family. 20 people. And a baby, Sarah guessed. Tabe nodded, a shadow crossing his face. He mimicked riding a horse, then pointed to his wounded arm and made a slashing motion. You were riding. Someone attacked you. Sarah pieced together. Another nod. Tabe pointed eastward, then drew his finger across his throat again. White men, Sarah said, understanding dawning. White men attacked you. Taabe's eyes held hers, filled with a wisdom and sorrow no child should possess. In that gaze, Sarah saw not an enemy, not a savage as men like Elijah would claim, but a boy torn from his family by the same violent divisions that had claimed so many lives on both sides. Without thinking, she reached across the space between them and took his uninjured hand in hers. I'm sorry, she said simply. Tabe didn't pull away. Instead, he squeezed her hand once, briefly, a gesture that transcended their differences and spoke of a shared humanity that no conflict could fully erase. Outside, an owl called into the night, its mournful cry echoing across the prairie. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, Sarah knew. But tonight, in this small cabin illuminated by firelight, a fragile understanding had taken root, as tenuous as a prairie flower, yet somehow just as determined to bloom. The next day dawned clear and bright. the storm's fury replaced by gentle sunshine that coaxed steam from the damp earth. Sarah rose before the sun, her mind too restless for sleep. She moved quietly through the cabin, stoking the banked coals in the fireplace to life, mixing cornmeal for the morning's johnny cakes. From his makeshift bed near the hearth, Tabe watched her through half-lidded eyes. "You're awake early," she said softly, not wanting to disturb the children still sleeping in the loft. "How's the arm feeling?" Tabe sat up, rolling his shoulder experimentally. He made a small gesture with his hand. Not perfect, but better. Sarah nodded, growing accustomed to their wordless communication. "Let me see." He extended his arm, allowing her to unwrap the bandage. The stitches held firm, the skin around them less inflamed than the day before. Sarah cleaned the wound with a cloth soaked in water she'd boiled with pine needles, then applied a fresh poultice of herbs, a remedy her grandmother had taught her mother, who had passed it to Sarah. Tabe watched the process with intense interest. When she finished, he pointed to the remaining herbs, then to his medicine pouch, making a gesture of mixing. "You use these for healing too?" Sarah asked. Tabe nodded, reaching for his pouch. He withdrew a small handful of dried leaves that Sarah recognized as willow bark, a remedy for pain and fever that she also used. He showed her, then pointed to her herb bundle with curiosity. For the next half hour, as the sun crept above the horizon, they engaged in a silent exchange of knowledge. Tabe identified the herbs she used by scent, showing approval or offering alternatives from his own small collection. Sarah was struck by how similar their healing practices were, despite coming from worlds that seemed so far apart. Their quiet communion was interrupted by the sound of Daniel's feet hitting the floor above, followed by his quick descent down the ladder. "Ma, Tabe!" he exclaimed, his voice hushed but excited. "I had a dream about a great buffalo hunt. Hundreds of buffalo and warriors on horseback with spears." Tabe looked up, smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. When Daniel mimed riding a horse and throwing a spear, Tabe nodded vigorously. "You hunt buffalo?" Daniel asked, pointing to Tabe, then mimicking the action again. Tabe nodded, then held his hand at chest height. "When you were younger," Sarah guessed. Another nod. Tabe then raised his hand higher, indicating adult height, and mimed a more powerful throw. "When you're older," Daniel interpreted. "When you're a man." "When he becomes a warrior," Emma corrected, climbing down from the loft with more decorum than her brother. Her tone was neutral, but Sarah noted the wariness that still lingered in her daughter's eyes. Tabe seemed to sense it too. He reached for Daniel's slate, which had been left on the table the night before. With careful strokes, he drew a simple picture, a circle of tipis with stick figures inside. He pointed to one figure, then to himself. "Your home," Sarah said. "Your village." Tabe nodded, then added more figures outside the circle. He pointed to their crude forms, then gestured in the direction Elijah had come from yesterday. His expression darkened. "The white men," Emma said quietly. "They attacked your village." Tabe shook his head. He drew a horse under one of the figures outside the circle. Himself, Sarah realized, then showed the figure moving away from the tipis. Next, he drew several more figures on horses, intercepting his path. "You were alone," Sarah said, understanding dawning. "Separated from your people. And then, white men found you." Tabe pointed to his wounded arm, then drew his finger across the slate, erasing part of the drawing. He looked up at Sarah, his dark eyes intense with meaning she couldn't fully grasp. "You escaped," she said slowly, "and found your way here." Tabe nodded once, solemnly. He added one more element to his drawing, a small cabin with 3 figures inside. Then he drew an arrow pointing from his figure to the cabin. The simple picture told a story more eloquent than words. A boy lost and wounded, finding unexpected sanctuary with strangers he'd been taught to fear. "Well," Sarah said, feeling the weight of his gaze, "we'd best have breakfast. There's work to be done today." As they ate, their johnny cakes drizzled with the last of the molasses, Sarah considered their situation. Tabe was healing quickly. Soon he would be strong enough to leave. But what then? She couldn't simply send him off across the prairie alone. If Elijah's reports were accurate, both settlers and militia were on high alert. A lone Comanche boy wouldn't stand a chance. After breakfast, Sarah set Emma to her studies and took Daniel with her to repair the fence damaged in the storm. To her surprise, Tabe insisted on coming too, carrying tools with his good arm despite her protests. "You should rest," she told him, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but hoping her tone conveyed her concern. Tabe shook his head stubbornly, pointing to his chest, then to the broken fence. His meaning was clear. He would help. They worked together under the warming sun, Sarah holding the fence posts steady while Daniel fetched tools. Taabe, one-handed but determined, helped secure the crossbeams. The work that would have taken Sarah all day alone was completed before noon. When they returned to the cabin for the midday meal, Emma met them at the door, her face pale. "Riders coming," she said, pointing westward. "And they're not settlers." Sarah's heart seemed to stop in her chest. She shaded her eyes, looking where Emma pointed. In the distance, barely visible against the horizon, a group of mounted figures approached. Their silhouettes were unmistakable, not the brimmed hats and straight-backed posture of white men, but the distinctive profiles of Native American riders, feathers and braids visible even at this distance. Tabe stepped forward, his body suddenly tense with alertness. He stared at the distant riders, then turned to Sarah, his expression a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. "Your people?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Tabe nodded, touching the medicine pouch at his chest. He said something in his own language, a soft stream of words that sounded like a prayer. "How many, Emma?" Sarah asked, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them reassuring. "I counted at least 15 before I ran inside," Emma replied, clutching Daniel's hand tightly. "Maybe more behind them." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. This moment had been inevitable from the instant she'd opened her door to Tabe, yet she found herself unprepared. What would these warriors think, finding their boy in the home of a white woman? Would they see her care for him, or only a potential enemy? "Inside, all of you," she said firmly. "Emma, fetch clean water and food. Daniel, bring Tabe's things from by the fire." She turned to the Comanche boy, whose eyes hadn't left the approaching riders. "It's all right," she said gently. "Your family has come for you." As they moved inside, Sarah cast one last glance at the distant riders, now close enough that she could make out details: painted faces, lances held upright, feathers streaming in the wind. There were more than 15, she realized with a chill. Many more. Taabe's people had come in force, and within minutes they would surround her small homestead completely. Inside the cabin, time seemed to stretch and distort. Sarah moved with deliberate calm, though her hands trembled slightly as she arranged cornbread and dried apple slices on her best plate, a painted china piece that had been her mother's, carried carefully across half a continent in their wagon journey west. A peace offering, though she had no idea if it would be received as such. Emma stood by the window, counting under her breath. 23, 24, they're still coming. Ma, I count at least 30 riders now. 30 Comanche warriors. Sarah's mouth went dry. She'd never heard of such a large party approaching a homestead without violent intent. Yet Taabe showed no fear, only a barely contained excitement, mixed with something that looked almost like worry as he glanced between Sarah and the window. "What do they want?" Daniel whispered, clutching his wooden soldier so tightly his knuckles whitened. Before Sarah could answer, Taabe approached the boy. With gentle hands, he took the toy soldier, studied it for a moment, then handed it back. He pointed to Daniel's chest, then made a fist over his own heart, a gesture Sarah interpreted as a call for courage. Daniel straightened his small shoulders. "I'm not afraid," he said, though his voice betrayed him with a slight quaver. "It's all right to be afraid," Sarah told him, smoothing his hair. "But remember what your father used to say, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite being afraid." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped. The sudden silence was somehow more terrifying than the approach had been. Sarah moved to the door, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "Stay inside," she instructed the children. "Emma, keep Daniel with you." She looked at Taabe. "I don't know if you should come with me or stay here." Taabe didn't hesitate. He moved to her side, standing straight despite his injured arm. The message was clear. He would face his people alongside her. Sarah nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, Taabe at her shoulder. The sight that greeted her stole what little breath remained in her lungs. Her entire homestead was surrounded. Comanche warriors on horseback formed a perfect circle around the cabin, the barn, the chicken coop, and the small vegetable garden. Every rider sat utterly still, creating a living wall of watchful silence. Their faces were painted with red and black streaks, their hair adorned with feathers and beads. Some carried lances decorated with scalps. Whether animal or human, Sarah couldn't tell and didn't want to know. From the center of the formation, a single rider moved forward. He was older than the others, with deep lines etched into his copper face and gray streaking his long braids. Unlike the others, his chest was bare, except for a magnificent breastplate of bone beads and bear claws. A single eagle feather stood upright in his hair, and his horse, a magnificent pinto stallion, wore only a simple bridle, no saddle. The leader stopped 10 paces from the porch. His dark eyes moved from Sarah to Taabe, showing no emotion that she could discern. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the creaking of leather, the occasional stamp of a hoof, and the wind sighing through the prairie grass. Finally, Taabe broke the silence. He stepped forward and spoke rapidly in his language, gesturing first to his bandaged arm, then to Sarah. His voice carried clearly in the still air, rising and falling with a cadence that reminded Sarah of the creek behind their property after the spring thaw, urgent yet musical. The leader listened without interruption, his expression unchanging. When Taabe finished, the man's gaze shifted to Sarah, assessing her with eyes that had seen more years and harder winters than she could imagine. "My son says you healed him," he said in heavily accented but understandable English, surprising Sarah so thoroughly that she took a half-step backward. "Says you gave food, shelter, protected from bad white men." Sarah swallowed hard. "Your son? Taabe is your son?" The leader nodded once. "I am Grey Wolf, chief of Antelope Band." He touched his chest. "Father of Taabe." Sarah felt a momentary vertigo as the true meaning of her actions came into focus. She hadn't just sheltered any Comanche child. She had unknowingly taken in the son of a chief. The implications were staggering. She began, then steadied herself. "Yes, Taabe was injured. I couldn't turn him away." Grey Wolf studied her with those unfathomable eyes. Many white women would leave Indian boy to die or kill themselves. His gaze moved past her to the cabin. You have children. Sarah fought the instinct to block his view. Yes, a daughter and son. Husband. My husband died. 2 winters passed. Something flickered in Grey Wolf's expression. Not quite sympathy, but perhaps recognition. He nodded slowly. Woman alone, children to protect. He looked at Tabe again, speaking a few words in their language. Tabe replied, pointing to his arm, then to the cabin. Grey Wolf seemed to come to a decision. He dismounted in one fluid motion despite his age, handing his horse's reins to a younger warrior. The other Comanche remained motionless, watching. Sarah felt the weight of 60 eyes upon her, judging her every movement. Show me, Grey Wolf said, gesturing to Tabe's arm. Show how you heal my son. Sarah hesitated only briefly before nodding. Please, come inside. She turned to lead the way, acutely aware of the warrior chief following her into the small cabin where Emma and Daniel waited, wide-eyed with a mixture of terror and fascination. Inside, Grey Wolf seemed larger somehow, his presence filling the modest space. He acknowledged the children with a brief nod, then focused on Sarah as she gathered her herbs and bandages. Emma, heat water, she said quietly. Daniel, bring the chair from the corner for our guest. The children moved woodenly to obey. Grey Wolf remained standing, watching as Sarah unwrapped Tabe's bandage to reveal the healing wound beneath. She explained as she worked, pointing out the herbs she had used, demonstrating how she had cleaned and stitched the gash. Grey Wolf crouched to examine her handiwork, his fingers hovering above the neat row of stitches without touching them. He murmured something to Tabe, who nodded in response. Good medicine, Grey Wolf said finally, straightening. Strong hands, good heart. He reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew something that glinted in the cabin's dim light, a knife with a blade of polished steel and a handle of carved antler. Sarah tensed, but Grey Wolf merely turned the knife, offering it to her handle first. Payment, he said. For life of my son. With trembling hands, Sarah accepted the gift. Thank you, she managed, but no payment was necessary. I only did what any decent person would do. Grey Wolf's weathered face creased slightly, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. Not many decent people left, white or Comanche. He looked around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the carefully mended curtains, the books stacked neatly on a small shelf. You live hard life, alone. We manage, Sarah said, a touch of pride entering her voice. Grey Wolf nodded, as if confirming something to himself. He spoke again to Tabe, longer this time. The boy listened intently, occasionally glancing at Sarah and the children. Finally, he responded with what sounded like a question. Grey Wolf considered, then nodded once more. My son asks to stay, Grey Wolf said, turning back to Sarah. Until arm is fully healed, says he can help with, he gestured vaguely around the cabin, work, tasks. Sarah blinked in surprise. Stay, but surely he wants to return to your people, to his family. Tabe says he has debt to pay, life debt. Grey Wolf's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He is young, but knows our ways. A life saved must be honored. Sarah looked at Tabe, who met her gaze steadily. In his eyes, she saw determination and something else, a plea. Whether it was a plea to stay or a plea for her to accept, she couldn't tell. And you would allow this? She asked Grey Wolf. You would trust your son to remain with a white family? The chief's eyes narrowed slightly. You trust my son in your home, with your children? It was a fair question. Sarah glanced at Emma and Daniel, who watched the exchange with undisguised fascination. In just 2 days, Tabe had gone from stranger to something approaching friend. Daniel had taken to him immediately, and even Emma's wariness had begun to thaw as she witnessed Tabe's respectful behavior and willingness to help. "Yes," she said firmly, "I do trust him." Grey Wolf nodded, as if she had passed some test. "Then we have understanding." He turned to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "I leave 4 warriors. They camp at Creek, watch over my son, watch over you." The implication was clear: protection, but also supervision. Sarah wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or concerned. "What about the other settlers?" she asked. "If they see Comanche warriors nearby, they might think truth," Grey Wolf interrupted, "that this place is under protection of Antelope Band." His eyes held hers. "No white man will harm you now. But you must keep my son safe." "I will," Sarah promised. "You have my word." Grey Wolf inclined his head slightly. "Words easy to speak, actions show truth." With that, he stepped outside, calling instructions to his warriors in their language. Through the window, Sarah watched as 4 young men dismounted, leading their horses toward the creek that marked the eastern boundary of her property. The rest of the band formed up behind Grey Wolf as he mounted his pinto stallion. The chief raised his hand once in Sarah's direction, a gesture of farewell, or perhaps warning, before leading his warriors away in a thunder of hoofbeats. Within minutes, they had disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind only dust clouds and 4 silent sentinels by the creek. Sarah turned to find Tabe watching her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Daniel had already moved to his side, tugging at his hand and pointing to the wooden horse carving, clearly delighted that his new friend would be staying. Even Emma seemed relieved, though she tried to hide it behind a show of practical concerns. "Where will he sleep, Ma? And what if Mr. Garrett comes back?" Valid questions, all. Sarah sighed, feeling the adrenaline of the encounter draining away, leaving bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. "We'll make a proper bed for Tabe by the fire," she said. "And as for Mr. Garrett and the others..." She fingered the knife Grey Wolf had given her, its weight unfamiliar but somehow reassuring. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it." Outside, the prairie wind picked up, bending the tall grass in waves that rippled to the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, a lone, piercing note that hung in the air like a question without an answer. The day's work still awaited them, unchanged by the morning's drama. Yet Sarah knew that everything had shifted nonetheless. A line had been crossed, an alliance formed. For better or worse, their fates were now bound together in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. Word traveled fast across the prairie, carried on the wind like dandelion seeds. By the following afternoon, Sarah could feel it in the air, the knowledge that something had changed at the Holloway homestead. The 4 Comanche warriors kept their distance, making their camp by the creek as Grey Wolf had instructed. They were nearly invisible unless one knew where to look, but their presence was undeniable, a shifting of the natural order that sent ripples through the surrounding countryside. Taabe settled into their household with surprising ease. He slept on a proper pallet by the fire, rose with the sun, and insisted on helping with chores despite his healing arm. Sarah found herself appreciating his quiet efficiency, the way he anticipated needs before they were spoken. Daniel followed him like a shadow, absorbing the boy's woodcraft skills with sponge-like enthusiasm. Even Emma had begun to relax around him, especially after he showed her how to weave a watertight basket from reeds gathered at the creek's edge. It was on the 3rd day after Grey Wolf's visit that the first neighbor appeared. Sarah was in the garden, harvesting early beans with Emma, when she spotted a horse and rider approaching from the north. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun. "It's Mrs. Peterson," Emma said, recognizing the bay mare. "And she's riding mighty fast for a social call." Sarah brushed dirt from her apron. "Take these inside," she told Emma, handing her the basket of beans. "And tell Tabe to stay in the cabin until I call for him." Emma nodded, understanding without being told the need for caution. As she hurried toward the house, Sarah moved to the front yard, composing her features into a welcoming smile. Martha Peterson reined in her horse with more haste than grace, her normally tidy appearance disheveled by the hard ride. Her grey-streaked hair had come loose from its bun, and her round face was flushed with exertion and what looked like barely contained panic. "Sarah Holloway!" she called, not bothering to dismount. "Is it true? Have you taken in one of them?" Sarah's smile faded. "Good afternoon to you too, Martha." "Don't you good afternoon me," Martha snapped, clutching her reins so tightly her knuckles whitened. "The whole county's talking about it." Elijah Garrett told his brother-in-law, who told Reverend Simmons, who told half the congregation yesterday that you've got a Comanche boy living under your roof. Sarah sighed. She'd known this moment would come, had rehearsed explanations in her mind, but now found them inadequate in the face of Martha's undisguised horror. "The boy was injured," she said simply. "I couldn't turn him away." "Injured? And what about your children?" "What about Emma and Daniel?" Martha leaned forward in her saddle. "Sarah, have you lost your senses completely? These savages killed the Wilson family, burned their barn with the livestock still inside, and now you're harboring one. He's a child, Martha, 12 years old at most." "They start young," Martha said darkly. "Train them to kill before they can properly walk." "My Henry says he saw one no older than Daniel take a scalp at Willow Creek last summer." Sarah doubted the veracity of this claim. Henry Peterson was known for embellishing stories after a few whiskeys at the trading post, but she held her tongue. "I appreciate your concern," she said instead, keeping her voice level. "But the matter is settled. Tabe is staying until his arm heals completely. Then he'll return to his people." Martha's eyes widened. "So it's true then, about the warriors?" Sarah hesitated. "What have you heard? That there are Comanche scouts watching your property, that anyone who approaches is being observed?" Martha glanced nervously toward the creek, as if expecting arrows to come whistling from the tall grass at any moment. "They're not scouts," Sarah corrected gently. "They're guards. Tabe is the son of their chief. They're here to ensure his safety, and by extension, ours." Martha's mouth fell open. "The chief's son, oh, Sarah." Her voice dropped to a horrified whisper. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The militia is forming in town. Johnson and Miller are gathering men, talking about dealing with the Indian problem once and for all. If they find out you're under Comanche protection, then they'll know to leave my family alone," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. Martha shook her head sadly. "That's not how they'll see it. They'll say you've chosen sides, that you're a traitor to your own kind." The word stung, though Sarah had been expecting it. "And is that what you think, Martha?" The older woman's expression softened slightly. "I think you're a good woman with a kind heart who's gotten herself into a situation she doesn't fully understand." She straightened in her saddle. "I came to warn you, Sarah, as Thomas's friend, as your friend. The men are meeting tonight at the Johnsons' barn. There's talk of riding out to investigate your situation." A cold knot formed in Sarah's stomach. "Thank you for the warning," Martha nodded grimly. "For what it's worth, I told Henry he'd better not be among them if they decide to come out here causing trouble. I remember how you nursed my Jimmy through the croup last winter when the doctor had given up hope." Her gaze drifted toward the cabin. "Just be careful, Sarah. Good intentions can lead to dangerous places out here." With that, she turned her horse and rode away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the yard, the weight of her decisions pressing down like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Inside the cabin, she found Tabe sitting at the table with Daniel, showing him how to mend a torn moccasin. The Comanche boy looked up as she entered, his dark eyes immediately reading the concern on her face. "And the bad news?" he asked in halting English, one of the phrases he'd learned over the past days. Sarah nodded, too troubled to be surprised at his growing vocabulary. "Neighbors know you're here. Some may not approve." Tabe frowned, glancing at Daniel, then back to Sarah. "Danger?" "Maybe," she admitted, seeing no point in hiding the truth. "There might be men coming tonight to see for themselves." Tabe stood, his expression resolute. He touched his chest, then pointed to the door. "I go, keep safe." "No," Sarah said firmly. "That's not the answer." "Ma," Emma spoke from where she'd been silently listening by the fireplace. "What are we going to do?" Sarah looked at her children's worried faces, then at Tabe, who stood ready to sacrifice his safety for theirs, despite having known them less than a week. In that moment, she knew there was only one path forward. "We're going to show them," she said, "that there's nothing to fear here, nothing except their own hatred." Outside, the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the prairie gold and crimson. In a few hours, darkness would fall, and with it, Sarah knew, would come the reckoning. As dusk settled over the prairie, Sarah moved with quiet determination. She lit every lamp in the cabin, positioning them in windows where their glow would be visible from a distance. Outside, she built up the fire pit in the yard until it blazed bright enough to illuminate the entire clearing. If men were coming with suspicion and fear in their hearts, she would not give them shadows to hide in. "They'll be able to see us from half a mile away," Emma observed, watching from the doorway. "That's the idea," Sarah replied, stoking the flames higher. "No secrets, nothing to suggest we have something to hide." Inside, she instructed Daniel to set the table for dinner as usual. She placed her husband's Bible prominently on the side table, open to the Gospel of Matthew. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." Whether any of their visitors would appreciate the message, she couldn't say, but it felt right to have it there. Tab had been quiet since Martha's visit, watching Sarah's preparations with solemn eyes. Now he approached her, holding something wrapped in a piece of soft hide. "And for you," he said, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a small object that gleamed in the lamplight, a beautifully crafted arrowhead of dark flint attached to a leather cord. Sarah stared at it, momentarily speechless. "Tabe." "Protection," he explained, touching his chest where his own medicine pouch rested. "Strong spirit." His English was improving daily, picking up words and phrases from their conversations. Sarah had noticed how he listened intently whenever they spoke, repeating words under his breath until he mastered them. She bowed her head, allowing him to place the cord around her neck. The arrowhead was cool against her skin, surprisingly light. "Thank you," she said softly. Tabe nodded, then moved to the window, peering out toward the creek where his father's warriors maintained their vigil. Sarah followed his gaze. "Will they intervene?" she asked, choosing her words carefully. "If there's trouble." Tab looked at her, his expression grave beyond his years. "Father's orders. Protect." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Protection could mean many things, not all of them peaceful. "Tabe, listen to me," she said urgently. "If men come tonight, there must be no violence. No one can be hurt, not them, not us, not your father's warriors. Do you understand?" Tabe held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I speak to them. No blood." Sarah hoped it would be enough. She adjusted the arrowhead at her throat, drawing strength from the boy's gift, and turned to check on dinner. A venison stew simmering in the iron pot, cornbread baking in the coals. Normal, everyday activities that felt surreal under the circumstances. The sound of approaching horses came just as they were sitting down to eat. First one, then several more, hoofbeats growing louder in the gathering darkness. Sarah counted at least 6 distinct rhythms before they slowed to a stop outside her yard. "Stay inside," she told the children, including Taabe in her instruction. "All of you, no matter what you hear." Emma clutched Daniel's hand. "Ma, please be careful." Sarah touched the arrowhead at her throat, then stepped onto the porch. The large fire she'd built illuminated the scene with unnatural clarity, revealing 6 mounted men at the edge of her property. She recognized them all, Johnson and Miller at the front, as Martha had warned, flanked by the Henderson brothers, young Simmons, the Reverend's son, and to her disappointment, Elijah Garrett. "Evening, gentlemen," she called, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "You're a long way from town to be paying social calls at supper time." Johnson, a burly man with a thick beard and perpetually sunburned nose, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "This ain't a social call, Mrs. Holloway, and you know it." "Then state your business," Sarah replied, remaining on the porch. "My children are waiting for their dinner." "Is it true?" Miller demanded, a tall, rake-thin man whose flinty eyes never seemed to blink. "You harboring an Indian boy? A Comanche?" Sarah kept her chin high. "I'm caring for an injured child. Yes, he's Comanche." A murmur ran through the group of men. Elijah shook his head, disappointment evident in his posture. "Sarah," he said, using her given name with a familiarity that made her bristle, "you lied to me when I asked if you'd had visitors." "I protected a child," she countered. "Would you have me turn away a wounded boy because of the color of his skin or the language he speaks?" "We would have you remember where your loyalties should lie," Johnson growled, "with your own kind, your neighbors, the folks who'd come running if you needed help." Sarah's anger flared. "My husband has been dead 2 years, Mr. Johnson. When my roof leaked last winter, who came to help? When my plow horse died in the spring, who offered me one of theirs?" She paused, letting the silence answer for her. "My loyalty is to what's right, to what Thomas would have done if he were here." "Thomas was a God-fearing man who understood the dangers of this territory," Miller interjected. "He wouldn't have put his family at risk harboring the enemy." "You didn't know my husband as well as you think," Sarah replied coldly. "And the only danger to my family right now is 6 men with guns who've ridden onto my property uninvited after dark." Simmons, barely 20 and clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Holloway, there's rumors about Comanche warriors watching your homestead." Sarah straightened her spine. "Not rumors, Mr. Simmons. Truth. 4 warriors camped by my creek, sent by Chief Grey Wolf himself to ensure his son's safety while he heals." This revelation sent another ripple of unease through the group. Johnson's hand moved to the rifle in his saddle holster. "You've made a deal with them?" he asked incredulously. "Woman, have you lost your mind? They can't be trusted. The minute that boy is back with his people, they'll come burn you out just like they did the Wilsons." "That's not what happened to the Wilsons," Sarah said sharply, "and you know it." A heavy silence fell. The truth about the Wilson massacre was rarely spoken aloud in the settlement, but most knew the reality that James Wilson had caught 2 Comanche boys hunting on what he considered his land. He'd shot one dead and beaten the other nearly to death before sending him back to his people as a message. The raid that followed had been brutal, but not unprovoked. "Doesn't matter what happened to the Wilsons," Miller said finally. "What matters is you've put the entire settlement at risk. Indians coming and going freely, warriors watching the roads. How long before they decide to attack? How many of our children will die because you couldn't turn away one of theirs?" "No one is at risk," Sarah insisted. Grey Wolf gave his word. The warriors are here to protect, not to threaten. Elijah shook his head sadly. Words from an Indian chief aren't worth the air they're spoken on. They don't think like us, Sarah. They don't value promises the way we do. From inside the cabin came the sound of movement. Before Sarah could stop him, the door opened and Taabe stepped onto the porch. He wore the same dignified expression she'd seen when he'd faced his father, proud but not defiant, strong but not threatening. He moved to stand beside her, his injured arm still bound but his posture straight and unafraid. Johnson cursed under his breath. Several hands moved to weapons. "This is Taabe," Sarah said, her voice clear in the tense silence. "Under son of Chief Grey Wolf of the Antelope Band. He was attacked by white hunters who didn't bother to see if he was friend or foe before they cut him down. I found him wounded on my doorstep during the storm, and I took him in. I doctored his arm. I fed him. And yes, I made an agreement with his father that Taabe would stay until he's fully healed, and in return his people would ensure our safety." She looked each man in the eye, one by one. "Now you have a choice to make. You can accept that sometimes mercy transcends the divisions we create, or you can ride away believing that every act of kindness toward those different from us is a betrayal." Taabe spoke then, his words careful and measured in his newly acquired English. "My father, honorable man, his word, true." He touched his chest, then extended his hand palm up toward the mounted men, a gesture of peace. "You'd do no harm to settlers, only protection for Sarah Holloway, for Emma, for Daniel." The fact that he knew the children's names, spoke them with such evident care, seemed to give the men pause. Elijah, in particular, studied the boy with new intensity. "How do we know this isn't some trick?" Henderson asked. "Get us to lower our guard, then attack when we're not expecting it." "You don't," Sarah answered honestly. "Just as I don't know that you won't return tomorrow with more men and violent intentions. At some point, trust must begin somewhere." For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled in the yard, sending sparks spiraling toward the star-filled sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing across the plains. Finally, Elijah sighed heavily. "Sarah's right about one thing. We've ridden onto her property, armed after dark. That's not how neighbors behave." He holstered his pistol deliberately. "I don't like this situation, don't understand it. But I knew Thomas Holloway, and he didn't marry a fool." Johnson scowled. "So we just ride away, leave her alone with them. We give her the courtesy of making her own decisions," Elijah replied. "And we watch, carefully." He looked directly at Sarah. "But know this, if there's any sign, any indication that this arrangement has put the settlement in danger, we won't be coming to talk next time." Sarah nodded, acknowledging both the concession and the warning. Fair enough. One by one, the men turned their horses, Miller and Johnson last and most reluctant. As they prepared to ride away, Elijah hung back. "I hope you know what you're doing, Sarah," he said quietly. "And for your children's sake, if nothing else." "I do," she replied, though in truth she was less certain than she appeared. "This is the right path, Elijah. Sometimes the hardest road is the one we're meant to travel." He shook his head, a sad smile touching his weathered face. "Thomas always said you had more faith than sense." With the tip of his hat, he turned his horse and followed the others into the darkness. Sarah stood on the porch long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, the tension gradually draining from her body. Taabe remained beside her, a silent presence that somehow anchored her against the turbulent emotions of the confrontation. "Thank you," she said finally, "for speaking to them, for showing them who you truly are." Taabe nodded solemnly. "Your words, brave, true." He touched the arrowhead that hung at her throat. "Strong spirit, The door opened behind them, and Emma peered out, Daniel's face visible behind her shoulder. "Are they gone, Ma? For good?" Sarah turned to her children, suddenly aware of how much she had risked, not just her own safety, but theirs. Yet looking at their faces, seeing the trust in their eyes, she couldn't regret her choices. "They're gone for now," she said, "and we have stew getting cold on the table. Come, all of you. This day has been long enough without adding hunger to our troubles." As they gathered around the table, Sarah noticed how naturally Tarbé had become part of their small circle, passing the cornbread, helping Daniel with his cup, responding to Emma's careful attempts to teach him new words. Whatever storms might still lie ahead, this moment of shared peace felt like a victory. Small perhaps, but significant. Outside, beyond the circle of firelight, 4 shadows moved in the darkness, vigilant guardians keeping their promise to a chief's son and the woman who had dared to see him as a child first, and an enemy, never. The days that followed unfolded with a strange new rhythm. Sarah rose each morning half expecting to find another party of settlers at her door, or perhaps more Comanche warriors joining the silent guardians by the creek, yet neither materialized. Instead, an uneasy peace settled over the homestead, punctuated by the ordinary tasks of frontier life, gathering eggs, tending crops, mending clothes, now shared among 4 pairs of hands instead of 3. Tab's wound continued to heal, the angry red line fading to pink as the stitches did their work. His arm grew stronger, and with it, his confidence in their small household. Sarah watched with quiet amazement as the boy who had arrived bleeding and fearful transformed into an integral part of their daily existence. He took to teaching Daniel his language with the same dedication that Daniel showed teaching him English. The 2 boys would sit for hours, pointing to objects and exchanging words, sometimes dissolving into laughter at mispronunciations. Even Emma had begun to participate, her initial wariness giving way to curiosity about Tarbé's world. "How do you say sky?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the heavens in shades of amber and rose. "Sompa," Tarbé replied, pointing upward. Then he swept his hand across the horizon. "Sompa dom, big sky." "Sompa dom," Emma repeated carefully. "It's beautiful." "The way it sounds, I mean," Tarbé nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Your words, also good, different." He pointed to the book in her lap, one of Thomas's old volumes of poetry. "You teach me this." Emma looked surprised, then pleased. "You want to learn to read?" "Words have power," Tab said simply. "I see this." From her place by the washtub, Sarah listened to the exchange with a swelling heart. How quickly barriers fell when given the chance. How easily understanding grew when fear was set aside. Not everyone shared this view, of course. The settlement had divided over Sarah's decision. Some, like Martha Peterson, had taken to bringing small offerings, a jar of preserved peaches, a sack of coffee beans, leaving them at the edge of the property rather than approaching the house directly. Others maintained a pointed distance, crossing to the opposite side of the trading post when Sarah came to town for supplies. Reverend Simmons had been particularly pointed in his Sunday sermon, speaking at length about the dangers of misguided charity and the corruption of innocent minds. Though he never mentioned Sarah by name, the intent was clear enough that several families refused to meet her eyes after the service. Yet there were surprises too. Elijah Garrett, who had been among those confronting her that night, arrived one afternoon with a half-dressed deer slung across his saddle. "Thought you might be running low on meat," he said gruffly, avoiding direct eye contact. "With an extra mouth to feed and all." Sarah accepted the offering with quiet dignity. "Thank you, Elijah." "We are grateful," He nodded, then hesitated, glancing toward where Tabe was showing Daniel how to carve a whistle from a willow branch. The boy seems settled. He is. His arm healing well. Very well. Another week, perhaps 2, and the stitches can come out. Elijah shifted uncomfortably, and then Sarah met his gaze directly. And then he will return to his people, as was agreed, and the warriors by the creek. I imagine they'll go with him. Elijah studied her face, searching for something, doubt, perhaps, or regret. Finding neither, he sighed. Some folks in town are saying you've gone native, that you'll be riding off with them when they leave. Sarah couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. And leave my home, my land. Everything Thomas and I built. She shook her head. No, Elijah, my place is here, but that doesn't mean I can't help a child in need, regardless of where he comes from. Elijah seemed to accept this, nodding slowly. Johnson and Miller still don't trust the situation, keep saying it's unnaturally quiet with those warriors so close. Perhaps that's because they mean us no harm, Sarah suggested. And do, which is what I've been saying all along, Elijah grunted non-committally, then mounted his horse. Well, I've said my piece, brought the venison, rest is up to you. He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Sarah with the distinct impression that something had shifted, not a full acceptance, but a crack in the wall of suspicion. That evening, as she prepared the venison for stewing, Tabe approached with unusual hesitancy. Sarah, he said, still using her name carefully, as if testing its shape in his mouth, I ask something. Of course, she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. What is it? Taabe pointed to the creek where the 4 warriors maintained their vigil. My people, alone. No talk, no food. He looked at her with earnest eyes. They protect us, but who helps them? The question caught Sarah off guard. In all the upheaval, she had given little thought to the warriors themselves, seeing them only as extensions of Grey Wolf's authority. Now, looking at Tabe's concerned expression, she felt a twinge of shame. You're right, she said softly. It's not hospitable to leave them so isolated. She considered for a moment. Would they accept an invitation to share our fire, our food? Tabe's face brightened. I ask. They respect you. Brave woman. The meeting was arranged for the following evening. Sarah spent the day preparing, baking extra cornbread, simmering a large pot of venison stew, even cleaning the cabin more thoroughly than usual, though she wasn't certain the warriors would come inside. As dusk fell, Tabe walked to the creek alone. Sarah watched from the porch, Emma and Daniel beside her, all 3 holding their breath as he spoke with the stoic figures who had kept their distance for so long. After what seemed an eternity, Tabe turned and began walking back, with all 4 warriors following several paces behind. They come, he said, his voice betraying a hint of surprise and pride. The warriors approached cautiously, their expressions guarded but curious. They were younger than Sarah had expected, the oldest perhaps 25, the youngest barely older than Emma. They carried no visible weapons, though Sarah had no doubt they were armed in less obvious ways. Tabe introduced them one by one: Strong Hawk, Running Fox, Black Knife, and the youngest, Little Thunder. Sarah greeted each with a nod of respect, then gestured to the fire pit where she had laid a generous meal. Please, she said, share our food, our fire. Tabe translated, and after a moment's hesitation, Strong Hawk, clearly the leader among them, nodded his acceptance. The warriors seated themselves with fluid grace, accepting the bowls Sarah offered with solemn nods of thanks. For a time, they ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant calling of night birds. Then, to Sarah's surprise, Daniel approached Little Thunder with his slate in hand. "Do you want to learn letters?" he asked, his voice earnest and unafraid. "Tabe is learning," Tabe translated, and Little Thunder's stern expression softened slightly. He looked to Stronghawk, who gave an almost imperceptible nod, then accepted the slate with careful hands. A boundary had been crossed, not demolished, but bridged. As the night deepened, more words were exchanged through Tabe's translation. Sarah learned that Stronghawk had a wife expecting their first child, that Running Fox was renowned for his skill with horses, that Black Knife had earned his name by stealing a cavalry officer's blade as a test of courage. And Little Thunder, it turned out, was Grey Wolf's nephew, Tabe's cousin, sent specifically to watch over his younger relation. The responsibility weighed heavily on him, making him seem older and more serious than his 16 years. By the time the warriors returned to their camp, something fundamental had changed. They were no longer faceless guardians, but individuals with stories, hopes, families. And Sarah's home was no longer merely a place they watched, but a hearth where they had broken bread. "Good," Tabe said simply as they cleared away the remains of the meal. "And a beginning," Sarah smiled, touching the arrowhead that still hung at her throat. "Yes, a beginning." Neither mentioned what hung unspoken between them, that all beginnings eventually lead to endings, and Tabe's time with them was growing shorter with each passing day. His arm was healing well, soon the stitches would be removed, and then, as promised, he would return to his people, but that was tomorrow's concern. Tonight, under the vast prairie sky dotted with countless stars, it was enough to know that something rare and precious had taken root. Understanding across the divide that had claimed so many lives on both sides. As Emma had said when speaking of Tabe's language, beautiful, different, but no less worthy of being learned. The morning Sarah removed Tabe's stitches dawned clear and cool, with a hint of autumn in the air despite the summer calendar. She worked methodically, her fingers steady as she snipped each thread and gently pulled it free from the healed flesh. Tabe sat perfectly still, watching her work with solemn eyes. "There," she said finally, applying a thin layer of salve to the scar, a pale line against his copper skin that would fade with time but never disappear completely. "Good as new." Tabe flexed his arm, rotating it fully for the first time in weeks. "Oh, strong again," he agreed, his English now fluid enough for basic conversation. He looked up at her, and Sarah saw the unspoken question in his eyes. "Yes," she said softly, answering what he hadn't asked. "I suppose this means you'll be leaving us soon." Tabe nodded slowly. "Father will come. 3 days." He touched his medicine pouch. "I sent message." "With Black Knife?" Sarah hadn't noticed the warrior's absence, but now realized she hadn't seen him during the morning's usual patrol of the property boundary. "I see." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the coming separation hanging between them. In just a few weeks, Tabe had carved out a place in their lives that would be impossible to fill once he was gone. Daniel would be devastated. He'd taken to following the Comanche boy everywhere, soaking up knowledge about tracking animals, identifying plants, carving wood. Even Emma had grown attached, spending evenings teaching Tabe to read from her father's books while he taught her words in his language. And Sarah had found in Tabe a reminder of all the possibilities that existed beyond the narrow confines of settler society. His presence had awakened something in her that had been dormant since Thomas's death, a willingness to challenge conventions, to stand firm in her convictions even when facing opposition. "I will remember," Tabe said, breaking the silence. "Always." He touched his chest. "Here," Sarah smiled, blinking back unexpected tears. "We will too." The door burst open as Daniel rushed in, his face alight with excitement. "Tabe! You promised to show me how to make a fishing spear today. Is your arm better? Can we go now?" Sarah and Tabe exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them to postpone the difficult conversation about departure. "Yes," Tabe said, standing. "I'm good. We go." As they headed for the door, Sarah called after them, "Don't go beyond the creek bend. And be back before noon. We need to go to town for supplies." The thought of venturing into the settlement filled her with apprehension. She hadn't been to town in over a week, sending Emma with Elijah Garrett for necessities rather than facing the stares and whispers herself. But they needed flour, sugar, ammunition, and several other items that couldn't wait any longer. "We'll be careful, Ma," Daniel promised, already halfway out the door. Emma looked up from where she was mending one of Sarah's dresses. "Do you think it's wise, going to town?" Sarah sighed. "Wise or not, it's necessary. We can't hide away forever." "We're not hiding," Emma pointed out. "We're living our lives. They're the ones making it difficult." "That may be, but we still need supplies." Sarah resumed packing the eggs they'd trade at the general store. "And I won't have this situation teaching you to be fearful." Emma was quiet for a moment, her needle moving steadily through the fabric. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said finally. "Not of Taabe or his people. I'm afraid of our people, of what hate makes them do." The wisdom in her daughter's words struck Sarah deeply. At 14, Emma was seeing the world with clearer eyes than many adults in the settlement. "Then we'll face that fear together," she said, head held high. Later that morning, with the wagon loaded and Tabe helping Daniel onto the bench seat, Sarah noticed a rider approaching from the east, not from town, but from the direction of the Wilsons' abandoned property. As the figure drew closer, she recognized Martha Peterson, riding hard, her normally tidy appearance disheveled. "Sarah!" Martha called as she reined in her horse. "Thank the Lord you're here. Martha, what's happened?" The older woman dismounted awkwardly, her breathing labored from the hard ride. "It's the militia. Johnson and Miller have been gathering men for days. They've got nearly 20 now, armed to the teeth." She cast a nervous glance at Tabe, who stood silently beside the wagon. "They're saying they've had reports of Comanche raiding parties crossing the river, using it as an excuse to deal with the Indian problem once and for all." Sarah felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "What does that mean exactly?" Martha's voice dropped. "They plan to ride out here, today, to escort the boy back to his people and drive off the warriors by the creek." She hesitated. "Some are talking about making an example, to discourage further Comanche presence in the territory." "An example," Sarah repeated, horror dawning. "They wouldn't dare. They're worked up, Sarah, been drinking since dawn, from what Henry tells me, and they've got that new settler with them, Blake, from Virginia, the one who's always talking about his time with the cavalry during the wars back east." Martha wrung her hands. "He's been filling their heads with stories, encouraging them." Sarah glanced at Taabe, who was listening intently, though she wasn't sure how much he understood. His expression remained calm, but she saw tension in the set of his shoulders. "When are they coming?" she asked. "Henry thinks mid-afternoon. They're gathering at the Johnson place now." Martha reached out, gripping Sarah's arm. "You need to get the boy away from here. Send him back to his people before they arrive. And if I don't," Martha's face paled, "then I fear there will be blood on both sides." Sarah looked toward the creek, where Stronghawk and the others maintained their watch. 3 warriors against 20 armed and angry men. It would be a massacre. And even if Grey Wolf arrived with more warriors in time, that would only lead to greater bloodshed, perhaps igniting the full-scale conflict that had so far been avoided in their territory. "Thank you for the warning, Martha," she said quietly. The older woman nodded, remounting her horse. "I'm sorry, Sarah, for all of it." She looked at Tab again, something like regret crossing her features. "The boy seems a good soul. I'll pray for his safety." With that, she turned her horse and rode away. Sarah stood motionless, weighing options that all seemed impossible. Send Tabe away alone, risking his safety on the open prairie. Keep him here and face down 20 armed men. Try to outrun the militia, abandoning their home. A hand touched her arm. Tabe, his dark eyes solemn but unafraid. "I heard," he said simply. "Danger comes," Sarah nodded, unable to shield him from this reality. "Yes, I go," he said. "Now, before bad men come. Alone, no. Tabe, it's too dangerous. If they're watching the roads. Not alone." He pointed to the creek. "Warriors, we ride fast. Find my father." Sarah felt her throat tighten. It was the logical solution, the only solution that might prevent bloodshed. Yet the thought of Tabe leaving so abruptly, without proper goodbyes, without certainty of his safe passage, tore at her heart. Daniel, who had been listening from the wagon, jumped down and ran to Tabe's side. "You can't go!" he cried, grabbing the older boy's hand. "You promised to teach me more spearfishing. You promised!" Tabe knelt to Daniel's level, his expression gentle but firm. "Must go. Protect family." He touched the boy's chest. "Remember what I teach. Here." Emma approached, her face pale but composed. "Will we see you again?" Tabe hesitated, then spoke with careful honesty. "Not no hope." Sarah made her decision quickly, moving with the decisive energy that had kept her family alive on the frontier. "Emma, fetch Tabe's things from inside. Daniel, help me unload the wagon." She turned to Tabe. "We'll take you and the warriors as far as Serpent Creek. It's well beyond where the militia is likely to be watching, and it puts you within a day's ride of your father's summer hunting grounds." Tabe's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "You help escape." "I help keep everyone safe," Sarah corrected. "And I keep my promise to your father, to protect you until you can return to your people." As Emma and Daniel hurried to obey her instructions, Sarah caught Tabe's arm. "Ah, but know this. Whatever happens today, you will always have a place here, always. This isn't goodbye forever, not if I have anything to say about it." Tabe held her gaze, then pressed his palm against the arrowhead that still hung at her throat. "Strong spirit," he said softly. "Like mother." The words, the highest compliment he could offer, nearly broke Sarah's composure. She squeezed his hand once, then turned away to prepare for the dangerous journey ahead, her mind already mapping the safest route through territory that had suddenly become hostile ground. The wagon rattled over the uneven prairie, Sarah driving with a reckless speed she would never have attempted under normal circumstances. Beside her on the bench seat, Emma clung to the wooden frame, her knuckles white with tension. Daniel sat in the back with Tabe. The two boys huddled close, speaking in hushed tones that mixed English and Comanche in the private language they had developed over the weeks. Flanking the wagon rode Stronghawk, Running Fox, and Little Thunder, their expressions grim and watchful as they scanned the horizon for signs of pursuit. They had agreed to Sarah's plan with reluctance, preferring to make a stand at the creek, but Tabe had spoken passionately in their council, convincing them that avoiding bloodshed was the greater victory. "How much farther to Serpent Creek?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible over the wagon's creaking wheels. "Another hour, maybe less if the ground stays firm," Sarah replied, keeping her eyes fixed on the rolling landscape ahead. They had chosen to avoid the main trail, instead cutting across open prairie where the wagon left visible tracks but offered greater speed and visibility. If the militia was following, at least they would see them coming. The sun had passed its zenith, the afternoon heat building, despite the hint of autumn in the air. Sarah's dress was damp with perspiration, her arms aching from holding the reins so tightly. Yet she pushed onward, allowing the horses only brief rests when absolutely necessary. During one such pause, as the animals drank from a shallow depression filled with rainwater, Stronghawk approached. Through Taabe's translation, he spoke with surprising gentleness. "Woman who stands firm," he said, using the name the Comanche had given Sarah after her confrontation with the settlers. "You risk much for the chief's son, for us." "Why?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Because it's right," she said finally. "Because I gave my word, and because I've seen enough death in my life. I won't be part of causing more." When Tub translated, Stronghawk nodded slowly. "Among my people," he replied, "such honor would make you blood kin. Remember this when we are gone." They resumed their journey, the sun beating down mercilessly. Despite the speed of their travel, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. If Martha's information was correct, the militia would have discovered their absence by now. Would they follow? Or would finding the homestead empty satisfy their immediate bloodlust? She glanced back at Daniel and Taabe, their heads bent together over something in Taabe's hands. A small carving, she realized, that the Comanche boy was completing even as they fled. The sight squeezed her heart. In another life, these two might have grown up as brothers, learning from each other, strengthening each other. Instead, they were being torn apart by the same hatred and fear that had claimed so many lives on the frontier. "Ma!" Emma said suddenly, pointing eastward. "Riders!" Sarah's blood ran cold. 3 figures on horseback had appeared on a distant ridge, silhouetted against the cloudless sky. Even at this distance, the shape of their hats and the rifles visible in their hands identified them clearly as settlers, not Comanche. Stronghawk had seen them too. He signaled to his companions, and the 3 warriors closed ranks around the wagon, their bodies tense with readiness. Little Thunder reached for the bow strapped to his back, but Stronghawk stopped him with a sharp word. "What do we do?" Emma asked, fear edging her voice. Sarah assessed their situation with brutal clarity. They were still at least half an hour from Serpent Creek, exposed on the open prairie with nowhere to hide. The horses were tiring, unlikely to outpace mounted pursuers much longer. And if those 3 riders were scouts for the main militia force, "We make for the stand of cottonwoods," she decided, pointing to a small cluster of trees about a quarter-mile ahead, the only feature breaking the rolling grassland. "We can defend that position if necessary." Taabe spoke rapidly to Stronghawk, who nodded his agreement. The warriors adjusted their formation, one moving ahead to scout the trees, while the others maintained their protective positions around the wagon. "They're following us," Emma reported, looking back, "and there are more now, at least 6. Sarah snapped the reins, urging the tired horses to greater speed. The wagon bounced violently over the uneven ground, threatening to overturn with each jolt. Daniel clung to the sideboards, his face pale with fear, while Taabe braced himself against the lurching motion. They reached the cottonwoods just as Running Fox returned from his scouting, reporting in quick Comanche that the area was clear. Sarah reined in the horses, helping Emma and Daniel down from the wagon, while the warriors established a perimeter among the trees. "Listen to me," she told her children, gripping their shoulders. "If there's trouble, any trouble at all, you hide. You crawl into the densest brush you can find, and you stay there until either I or Taabe comes for you. Do you understand?" They nodded, their eyes wide with fear and the terrible understanding that their mother was preparing for violence. Sarah turned to Taabe, who stood ready with a knife, his only weapon, gripped firmly in his hand. "You should go," she told him. You and the warriors. Make for Serpent Creek while we delay them. Taabe shook his head firmly. No leave you. He looked at Daniel and Emma. No leave family. Before Sarah could argue further, Stronghawk gave a low warning call. The riders had drawn closer. 8 of them now, approaching at a steady pace that suggested confidence rather than caution. Sarah recognized Johnson at their head, his broad-brimmed hat and burly frame unmistakable even at a distance. Beside him rode a leaner man she didn't recognize, likely the Blake that Martha had mentioned. Get behind me, Sarah told the children, moving to stand at the edge of the cottonwood grove. Stronghawk positioned himself to her right, Running Fox and Little Thunder spreading out among the trees, using the trunks as partial cover. The riders slowed as they approached, fanning out in a semicircle about 30 yards from the trees. Johnson raised his hand and the group halted. "Mrs. Holloway," he called, his voice carrying easily across the open space. "Step away from the Indians and bring your children with you. We've come to escort you safely home." "My family and I are in no danger, Mr. Johnson," Sarah replied steadily, "and we've no need of an escort." Johnson's face darkened. "Maybe you don't understand the situation, ma'am. These savages have been holding you captive." "That's a lie, and you know it," Sarah cut him off. "I chose to help Taabe. I chose to honor the agreement with his father, and I chose to leave my home today because I heard you were coming with violent intentions." The lean man, Blake, urged his horse forward a few steps. "Mrs. Holloway, I've seen what these devils can do to a white family, to women and children. Whatever they've told you, whatever promises they've made, they can't be trusted." "And you can," Sarah demanded. "A group of armed men who've come to threaten a boy and the people protecting him. We didn't come looking for a fight," Johnson insisted, though the rifles in their hands told a different story. "We came to set things right. To send these Comanche back where they belong and make sure they understand that our settlement is off limits." Sarah stood her ground. "They're already leaving. Today, peacefully. There's no need for threats or violence." Blake laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Peacefully. There's no such thing as a peaceful Comanche. They understand one language, ma'am, and that's force." He leveled his rifle, not directly at anyone, but close enough to Stronghawk to make his meaning clear. "Now, I'll ask one more time. Step away and let us handle this." Sarah felt a presence beside her. Taabe, moving up to stand at her left shoulder. His face was composed, showing neither fear nor anger, just a quiet dignity that seemed beyond his years. "And no need for blood," he said in his careful English, addressing the mounted men directly. "We go. Leave in peace." Blake's eyes widened slightly at hearing the boy speak English. For a moment, Sarah thought the simple humanity of it might penetrate the man's prejudice. Then his expression hardened again. "Teaching them our language now. Next, you'll be inviting them to Sunday service." He spat on the ground. "Johnson, I've seen enough. These people are compromised, lost their senses along with their loyalty." Johnson hesitated, glancing at the other riders, some of whom were looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "Sarah," he said, using her given name for the first time, "be reasonable. Send the boy with us. We'll see he gets back to his people without harm. But this arrangement, whatever it is, it can't continue. It's putting the whole settlement at risk." Sarah was about to respond when a sound stopped the words in her throat. Hoofbeats, many of them, approaching from the west. All heads turned to see a cloud of dust on the horizon, resolving gradually into a column of riders, moving at speed toward their position. "Ambush!" Blake shouted, raising his rifle. "Ah, they've led us into a trap!" "No!" Sarah cried, but her protest was drowned by the sudden crack of Blake's rifle firing into the air, a warning shot that startled birds from the cottonwoods and sent the militiamen into defensive positions. Stronghawk barked orders to Running Fox and Little Thunder, who melted back into the trees, positioning themselves to protect Taabe. Sarah grabbed her children, pulling them deeper into the grove as the thunder of approaching horses grew louder. Through gaps in the foliage, she could see the newcomers clearly now. At least 30 mounted Comanche warriors in full regalia, feathers and paint catching the afternoon sun as they rode. At their head, astride a magnificent pinto stallion, was a figure Sarah recognized immediately from his bearing and the single eagle feather standing upright in his hair. Grey Wolf had arrived, and with him, more warriors than the small militia could hope to stand against. Time seemed to slow as the two forces faced each other across the sun-baked prairie. On one side, 8 militiamen with their rifles half-raised, uncertainty now mingling with their earlier bravado. On the other, Grey Wolf's warriors, armed with bows, lances, and a few firearms, their faces painted for battle, their horses pawing restlessly at the ground. Between them stood the small grove of cottonwoods where Sarah huddled with her children, Taabe, and the 3 warriors who had been their guardians. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one nervous trigger finger, and the prairie would run red with blood. Sarah made her decision in that frozen instant. Ignoring Emma's frantic whisper to stay hidden, she stepped out from the trees, moving deliberately into the open space between the opposing groups. She carried no weapon, her empty hands held slightly away from her sides, her chin raised. "Enough," she called, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "There will be no violence here today, not on my account, not on anyone's." Grey Wolf raised his hand, and his warriors remained still. Johnson and Blake exchanged glances, but neither ordered their men to stand down. "Mrs. Holloway, get back to cover," Blake urged, his rifle still trained on the Comanche line. "We're outnumbered." "This is about to get ugly." "Only if we make it so," Sarah replied, standing her ground. She turned to face Grey Wolf, meeting his steady gaze without flinching. "Chief Grey Wolf, I promised to protect your son until he could return to you. I intend to keep that promise, peacefully." Grey Wolf studied her for a long moment, then dismounted in one fluid motion. Ignoring the tense militiamen, he walked toward Sarah with measured steps, stopping a few paces away. "Woman who stands firm," he said, his deep voice carrying easily in the still air. "You have honored your word. Now I honor mine." He raised his hand, and the warriors behind him lowered their weapons slightly, not standing down completely, but easing the immediate tension. From the trees, Taabe emerged, moving to stand beside Sarah. His back was straight, his expression composed as he faced his father and spoke in their language, a few sentences delivered with quiet dignity. Grey Wolf listened, then nodded once. "My son speaks well of you," he told Sarah. "Says you treat him as family, teach him, protect him even now." His eyes moved to the militiamen. "From your own people," Blake spat on the ground. "They're not her people anymore. She's chosen her side. I've chosen humanity," Sarah corrected him sharply. "Something you seem to have forgotten in your fear and hatred." "That's enough, Blake," Johnson interrupted, finally lowering his rifle. The reality of their situation had clearly sunk in. They were badly outnumbered, and any violence now would likely result in their deaths. "And we didn't come for a massacre. Speak for yourself," Blake muttered, though he too lowered his weapon slightly. Sarah seized the moment of uncertainty. "Mr. Johnson, you and your men will return to the settlement. Now, tell everyone that Chief Grey Wolf came for his son, as was arranged from the beginning. Tell them that no blood was shed, because both sides chose restraint over vengeance." Johnson's face flushed with anger at being ordered about by a woman, but he couldn't deny the logic of her words, or the 30 warriors watching his every move. "And what about you?" he demanded. "You coming back to civilization, or riding off with them?" He jerked his head toward the Comanche. Before Sarah could answer, Emma and Daniel emerged from the trees, coming to stand on either side of their mother. Emma's face was tear-streaked but determined, while Daniel reached out to take Tabe's hand. "We're going home," Sarah said firmly, "to our farm, where we've always belonged." Grey Wolf watched this exchange with inscrutable eyes, then spoke again. "Woman who stands firm has earned the respect of the Antelope Band. Her home is under our protection." He looked directly at Johnson. "Tell your people, any who harm this family will answer to me." Blake made a disgusted sound. "You're going to let an Indian dictate? We're going to avoid unnecessary bloodshed." Johnson cut him off. "Today, at least." He gathered his reins, preparing to turn his horse. "This isn't over, Sarah. The settlement won't stand for it." "Perhaps not all of them," Sarah acknowledged, "but some will understand. Some already do." She thought of Martha Peterson, of Elijah Garrett, of the families who had left small offerings at the edge of her property, silent support for her choice to show compassion rather than fear. Johnson gave a curt nod, then signaled to his men. They wheeled their horses and began riding eastward, back toward the settlement. Blake lingered a moment longer, his face twisted with thwarted rage, before spurring his mount to follow. As the militia retreated, Sarah turned back to Grey Wolf. Now that the immediate danger had passed, she could see the relief in his eyes as he looked at his son, whole, healthy, and safe. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not seeking blood." Grey Wolf inclined his head slightly. "Blood flows too easily on this land. Brings more blood. Never ends." His weathered face softened almost imperceptibly. "My son says you understand this." "I try to," Sarah replied, "though I have much still to learn." "As do we all." Grey Wolf reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew something that gleamed in the afternoon light, a bracelet of intricate beadwork in blue and white patterns, with small silver discs woven into the design. He held it out to Sarah, for woman who stands firm. "Symbol of peace between our people." Sarah accepted the gift with both hands, recognizing the profound significance of the gesture. "I will treasure it," she said. "And remember." Grey Wolf nodded, then turned to Tabe. Father and son exchanged words in their language, too quick for Sarah to catch the meaning, but the emotion behind them was clear. Then, to her surprise, Grey Wolf spoke to Daniel, who still clutched Tabe's hand as if to prevent his departure. "Small brave one," he said, his accent thick, but his English understandable. "My son speaks well of you, says you have warrior's heart." Daniel blinked back tears, straightening his small shoulders. "Will Tabe come back to visit us?" Grey Wolf glanced at Sarah, then back to the boy. "Perhaps, when moon is full again?" "If mother permits." Hope bloomed on Daniel's face. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes pleading. "Ma, can he?" Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Yes," she said softly, "he will always be welcome." Tabe knelt before Daniel and Emma, reaching into his pouch to withdraw 2 small carvings, a horse for Daniel, similar to the first gift he had given him, and for Emma, a delicate bird with outstretched wings. "Uno, remember," he said, placing them in their hands, "until I return." Emma, usually so reserved, threw her arms around Tabe's neck in a fierce embrace. "You'd better," she whispered. Tabe stood, facing Sarah one last time. Words seemed inadequate for all that had passed between them, all that had changed because she had opened her door to a wounded boy on a stormy night. "Thank you," he said simply, touching the scar on his arm. "For life." For teaching. He placed his hand over his heart. Family. Sarah couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. Instead, she reached out and touched the arrowhead that still hung at her neck, his first gift to her, a talisman that had come to represent far more than protection. With a nod of understanding, Taabe turned and walked to where Stronghawk held a horse ready for him. The boy mounted with practiced ease, taking his place beside his father. Grey Wolf raised his hand in a final salute to Sarah, then gave the signal to his warriors. As one, they wheeled their horses and began riding westward toward the setting sun. Sarah and her children stood watching until the dust cloud faded from the horizon, leaving only the vast, empty prairie and the small stand of cottonwoods bearing witness to what had transpired. "Will they really come back, Ma?" Daniel asked, still clutching his carved horse. "I believe they will," Sarah replied, her hand covering the beaded bracelet now circling her wrist. Taabe keeps his promises. The journey home was quieter, the wagon moving at a more measured pace now that the need for haste had passed. As they crested the final rise and saw their small cabin nestled against the darkening sky, Sarah felt a profound sense of both loss and possibility. Something precious had gone from their lives, yet something equally valuable remained, a bridge built between worlds that most considered forever divided. In the days that followed, Sarah faced the consequences of her choices. Some in the settlement shunned her openly now, crossing the street when they saw her coming, refusing to trade with her at the general store. Reverend Simmons delivered a scathing sermon on the dangers of forgetting one's place in God's ordained order, though he carefully avoided naming her directly. Yet for every door that closed, it seemed another opened. Martha Peterson brought a fresh-baked pie and stayed for tea, asking thoughtful questions about Taabe and his people. 3 families who had lost loved ones in previous conflicts approached Sarah after Sunday service, seeking to understand rather than condemn. And Elijah Garrett, to everyone's surprise, publicly defended her actions at a town meeting, arguing that a little more mercy and a little less fear might serve us all better in these difficult times. Small changes, perhaps, but meaningful ones. Seeds planted in rocky soil that might, with care and patience, someday flower into genuine understanding. 1 month later, as the promised full moon rose over the prairie, Sarah sat on her porch with a cup of coffee warming her hands against the autumn chill. Emma and Daniel had long since gone to bed, though she suspected they were too excited to sleep soundly. The night was quiet, the only sounds the gentle rustle of wind through the tall grass and the occasional hoot of a hunting owl. She didn't see them approach. They moved like shadows across the darkened landscape. But suddenly, they were there. Grey Wolf, Stronghawk, and between them, Taabe, his face breaking into a rare, wide smile as he caught sight of her. "You came," Sarah said, rising to greet them. Taabe dismounted, looking taller somehow, more confident in his movements. "I promised," he replied, his English noticeably improved. "Family." Behind her, the cabin door opened as Emma and Daniel tumbled out, alerted by some sixth sense to their visitor's arrival. Their joyful greetings filled the night air, momentarily drowning out the prairie's whispered songs. As Sarah watched Taabe embrace her children, she thought about the night that had started it all. The storm, the wounded boy, the choice that had seemed so simple in the moment, yet had rippled outward to touch so many lives. She fingered the arrowhead at her throat, its edges worn smooth now from months of unconscious touching. Some might call what she'd done foolish, even dangerous. Perhaps it had been. But standing here now, watching as Grey Wolf solemnly presented Daniel with a small bow-sized, perfectly for his height, seeing Emma shyly showing Taabe her progress in writing his language, Sarah knew she would make the same choice again without hesitation. For in this harsh land where differences too often led to bloodshed, she had discovered a profound truth. Compassion was not weakness, but the greatest strength of all. It could build bridges where none seemed possible, forge connections that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and culture, and plant seeds of hope in the most unlikely soil. As the night deepened around them, the full moon casting silver light across the prairie, Sarah Holloway stood in the doorway of her small cabin, not just a survivor on this unforgiving frontier, but a builder of something far more precious than walls and fences. A future where her children might live without the burden of inherited hatreds, a community that might in time learn to see with clearer eyes, a small corner of the vast American wilderness where understanding had taken root, fragile but growing stronger with each passing season. It was, she thought, watching as Taabe demonstrated a new carving technique to an enthralled Daniel, perhaps the most valuable harvest this land had ever yielded.